There are a number of considerations you should have in mind when you're developing or even reviewing a traffic impact study or traffic impact analysis. One of the most important foundations of the study is your traffic count data. So looking at that existing roadway network, what are your traffic volumes, what are your turning movement counts, how many people turning left, right, or going through in a particular intersection that is in your study area. And often where this can be challenging is if you only have one point of data. It's hard to know if it's an outlier if you only have one point. That's why it's usually best if you have maybe multiple counts or multiple high-level data to know whether or not the data point you're using is reasonable and within the character of a typical day. It's tough to know if it's an outlier with just one data point. It's also usually very important to avoid special events unless it's in particular focused on a special event venue that you're looking at. So trying to avoid those kind of outlier days, typically a midday of the week is ideal for your traffic counts, but that's an underlying foundation of the study that you need to make sure has correct and reliable data. We can also organize a lot of these thoughts around the four-step process. So starting with trip generation, this is looking at the trips that are produced or attracted to that development. One of these is the land use type. So is that land use type appropriate? Often what can happen is that there may not be a comparable land use type in the ITE manual. Often though it is. If you have a fast food restaurant or an office building or a movie theater, any very typical land use type, that's going to be in the ITE trip generation manual. But there may be other newer types of developments that may not be in there. One example that I had heard of several years ago is the axe throwing locations, and that's becoming more prominent. And a lot of people were trying to determine what they should use for trip generation rates for these because there weren't any existing axe throwing locations in the trip generation manual. There weren't other local locations to focus on. It may have been the first one in the community, maybe even the first one in a region. So I heard of a creative alternative to use for this, and it was a bowling alley, because bowling alleys and these axe throwing facilities have some similarities. They're organized in lanes. They usually have food and drinks available. And so I think it was a very reasonable step to relate those type of facilities with an existing one, such as a bowling alley. So that sometimes is needed with new types of land use, new businesses. Another one that I've seen some analysis on is looking at marijuana dispensaries. Is that more like a pharmacy? Is it more like specialty retail, or is it something else? And often another thing we look at and consider is there's a popularity side to this, that the first few weeks or first few months may have different trip generation characteristics than the long run average. The scale is also very important. So is it within the bounds of the ITE trip generation data? Is it consistent with sites that are within that grouping? One of the distortions that I've heard a lot of people discussing in recent years is looking at facilities that are changing in relation to market demands, and one of those is looking at fast food restaurants. Some of those we're seeing shrinking or even eliminating dining room space in favor of larger and more drive-through lanes. And where that becomes problematic is that if you're using your independent variable as your square footage, that's going to tell a different story if you are purposely shrinking that square footage and adding drive-through lanes. So that's can be a very difficult thing to do. And again, the ideal would be go collect local data. If there is another one of these existing facilities there, compare how that works against the existing data based on square footage, and hopefully come up with something that's reasonable for that trip generation. So again, there's a lot of details that are important in this trip generation step of our four-step process. Internal capture and pass-by trips is another one. Are we using reasonable rates for internal capture and pass-by trips? And it could be either the values you may be using are too low or too high. There are some national data for this, but it can be highly dependent on a specific location. So again, making sure that you have a reasonable understanding and reasonable estimates of the trips that will be internally captured within the development. So the trips that visit multiple businesses but stay within the one development. And then on the pass-by side, the vehicles that are on the main line passing by that business and decide to stop in. And both of those can be highly variable and very site-specific and business-specific. For trip distribution, looking at where the trips are going, this is one that's probably more art than science. On the science side, the data side, we're looking at existing traffic counts, and that's going to give us some useful insights, and usually is going to be a pretty reasonable way to start our trip distribution. But there may be other things in that existing traffic count data may not tell the complete picture. So thinking about that trip distribution, are the trips attracted and going or produced to and from locations that make sense and are reasonable within the community or within the region? Mode split is one that is we're working on more and more data, and we need more research in this area, but we continue to add data and information about the mode split. This is obviously mostly related to reduction in automobile usage. So does the design of a facility or its connection to other multimodal facilities, does that reduce the vehicle usage? For instance, do you have good transit connectivity? Are you connected to a greenway? All those things may reduce the vehicle trips, and having an accurate estimate of what that may look like is very useful. Of course, if you've got other local sites that are similar and you can go observe those locations and look at how transit plays a role or how bicycle and pedestrian trips are made, that would be really useful to incorporate that information into your TIA or TIS. And then finally, the traffic assignment, the fourth step in the four-step process, what specific routes and paths will be used. One of the big things here, obviously you're building on each of those previous steps. So if there's any mistakes there, they're going to be apparent in the traffic assignment step. But looking at, are you sending traffic on roads that are already over capacity? So is your model capacity constrained? Are you thinking about that as you say these trips will take these specific routes or paths? Well, if they're over capacity, likely people are going to adjust those routes and maybe go a different way. So it's important to have that in mind as you are doing that traffic assignment step of the process. And then other road projects and developments. Some of the big things here are missing important developments in the vicinity that will be present before this particular project or development is completed. And it could be that there are improvements that those other developments are making, or it could just be that background traffic volume that will be present that needs to be considered when developing the TIA and the mitigation effects and considering the traffic volumes. And then on the road project side, it can be that there are plans from the transportation agency to improve the roadway in the vicinity of the project. And so seeing how that lines up with the project timeline, will it be completed before the project is completed? Maybe it won't be. What can be done in the meantime? And just making sure all that is aligned well and considered through that analysis. These are just some of my thoughts and important considerations, things I've noticed over the years. Let me know in the comments if you found other things that need to be considered more carefully when preparing or reviewing a TIA or TIS.